So Jennifer's been a really tireless advocate for native plants. She's currently the chair of the Wildflower Ambassador Program, the Santa Clara Valley chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And she's also co-admin for the Native Plant Resource Teams, which is a program of the Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour, which happens here in the East Bay, and it's actually happening this weekend. So it's a great opportunity to actually go out and see some native gardens in action. I'm actually volunteering at one of the houses this Saturday, so maybe you'll see me out there if you come out. And in her free time, Jennifer works as at Stanford Medicine as a senior major gift officer. Yeah, we're very lucky to have her here. Please help me welcome Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, and it's true. I was organic gardening when we lived in Seattle, organic gardening down here, and I thought I was doing everything to be a good steward of the earth. I didn't use any chemicals or fertilizers or anything. And so my garden didn't look like this in Seattle, but it had many of these elements where it was lots of beautiful flowers and the butterflies would come through and they would have a little sip of nectar and then they would fly away. And I didn't know until actually very recently that that's just like having a bar where there's something to drink, there's some nectar, but there really isn't any food to carry on the next generation of butterflies. So anyway, so my garden was pretty much a food desert as far as the butterflies and bees and other creatures were concerned. And then during lockdown, I think a lot of us slowed down a little bit, maybe paid attention to some things. And I think during lockdown was the first time that I really made time to like listen to some gardening videos, and we tuned into one by Doug Tallamy. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. And he has, I would say, if you do nothing else, I have a link to his talk at the end of this. And by the way, for anybody who's taking notes, I have a QR code and link to all these slides at the end. And I use a lot of words on the slides because for anybody who's not here, if they just want to scroll through and get the gist of things, it's all here. But basically, he pointed out that the flowery garden that I had, again, was just a bar. We need host plants. We need native plants that co-evolve with all of our bees and butterflies and birds over thousands, in some cases, millions of years. And the plants developed defenses so they wouldn't all get eaten. And the insects developed some, secret way to unlock some of the plant's codes. And so you think about monarchs and milkweed. Milkweed really only feeds like 3 species, the queen, the monarch, I think there's one other we don't really see. So what we needed to grow are the host plants, and those are the native plants. And we have the power, I mean, it's really sad to think about insect declines, which we'll look at in a moment, but we have the power to fight back against it. So here's a little bit of background about that. I knew, and maybe every school child who pays attention knows, that the plants provide us with oxygen, and it's what we need to breathe, and we eat many crop plants, and I knew that about plants. But I think I had missed the memo about this coevolution of the native plants and all of the different species that rely on them. So native plants are most critically important across the globe in being able to be eaten, especially by insects and especially by caterpillars, because caterpillars are the biggest converters of that sun's energy that goes into the plant, into the ecosystem. So yeah, welcome. Yeah, and the best native plants, there are some native plants, again, that feed just 1 or 2 species, but I'm focusing a little bit tonight on the keystone plants. If you think about a keystone kind of holding up an arch, these are the plants that will feed the most insects, the most caterpillars, and create the most biodiversity in our gardens. Of course, we can grow the other stuff as well, but we want to focus on that. And the other thing I want to add is what I think is so smart about Doug Tallamy is he says, just go 70% native. They've looked at all of the research. If we all do our part and we have a lot of native plants, there's always like grandma's rose or your favorite lavender that the finches eat. Keep those. You know, you don't have to be extreme about it, but try to create as much biodiversity in your garden as you can. So just so that you understand a little bit of background about the insect situation, this chart down here shows that the total global insect population decline over the past decade has been 41%. These are vary by species, as the chart shows. Bees, 46%. So pollination services are going down dramatically. All of the Lepidoptera that feed the baby birds, the caterpillars are the biggest feeders of our baby birds. Those species are all dropping. And it's even made like National Geographic headlines, you'll miss them when they're gone, or the New York Times saying insect apocalypse is here. And so there are a lot of causes behind this we can look at, but it's really important to start to fight back. And it was actually kind of, Doug tries not to go too dark, but in one of his talks, he said we could hit a point of no return with insect populations within 16 years. So we need to move quickly to try to grow more natives. And just take a moment to look at the severe decline, what's causing it. I had to pick on my aunt's complex up there at Rossmore. Beautiful place, but it's a good example of a lot of development, and we can't help this. We need homes and everything, but we paved over a lot of the native plant space that supported biodiversity. And we've introduced plant species, so everything in this picture is not native and has been imported, and those plants are not edible. Those plants are edible in another country, maybe in China or in Europe, but they're not edible to the insects here. So we have agriculture down below where instead of our ancestors would often have a big hedgerow around their farm, and the hedgerow would have a lot of native plants in it that would support the caterpillars and the insects were eaten by the birds, and the birds would come eat the pests. But here, the way that we do agriculture now is very chemically reliant, and we don't create places, few insects could survive in this kind of agricultural situation. And on top of that, we throw down a lot of pesticides and herbicides. And so with our farming, it's pretty much the default. So if you're not buying organic, that's pretty much what it is. And then there's climate change. And some of that even is within our reach to try to help address or mitigate or fight back against. So all of this may sound really, dark and hopeless, but each of these items is actually something we can address and we can start in our own gardens to fight back. And so going back to the native plants and the keystone plants, they are our arsenal against this, this terrible decline of insect populations. And on the left, all those green bars are native keystone plants. On the far left is oak. There's a type of native cherry that feeds a lot of different, the leaves feed a lot of different Lepidoptera that feed the baby birds and other ecosystems. We have our own brands of types of currant, ceanothus, maple. We have our own native rose here in California. So all of these beautiful plants in green really feed biodiversity. The little puddle of red over here, these are the plants like eucalyptus and acacia and fennel and ivy that are in a lot of our gardens. Agapanthus, I had that in my own garden at one point. It doesn't really feed anything. There might be a pest or so that came over with it from its place of origin. So these imported plants are creating a huge food deficit. But let's look at the caterpillars that we could be feeding with these beautiful native plants and some of the plants themselves. So these are some of our local caterpillars, and even a little chrysalis down there on the bottom left. But these eat only the native plants that they co-evolved with. There are a few exceptions. Sphinx moths will eat anything. So like tomato hornworms will eat tomatoes, but for the most part, these rely on native plants. And they grow into really beautiful butterflies and moths that also feed the birds. And you can find these up in the tree canopy. You can find them, it's actually hard to find them up in the tree canopy because it's so high up. But you can find them in the tree canopy. They eat sometimes flower buds, sometimes the leaves, most often the emerging leaves. And often they drop to the ground. We think of monarchs as forming a little chrysalis and attaching it, but not all butterflies and moths do that. Many of them drop into the leaf litter in the at the base of the plant. And if you leave that leaf litter, then they have a chance to flourish or be bird food. I mean, either way, whether they turn into a beautiful moth, butterfly or moth or not. The lower left is actually a caterpillar that I dug up when I was weeding underneath one of my plants. And man, that thing can move fast, but Brian caught a picture of it while I had it on my hand. And then this little brown thing, when I was a child, I would dig in the dirt because I was that kind of kid. And this is actually chrysalis for a little moth. I actually hatched it out. It's a lesser black dart moth. And that, anyway, it's kind of fascinating. I think kids would actually enjoy doing some of this and discovering some of these things, and especially holding that little chrysalis. The top of it actually wiggles if you hold it in your hand. It was really a weird sensation. So anyway, and there's a website I'll talk about a little bit later called Calscape about the butterflies and moths, that you can grow from different plants. And then this is what they turn into. These are all local butterflies and moths. There's actually several hundred of them that are local to your area. And so you can plant the plants that feed them. And so they seek nectar like they did from my old garden. They pollinate flowers, and that happens even with not native, not native plants. They provide food for the birds, add beautiful color to our gardens. And then they actually have individual nectar preferences. So certain plants you can plant to attract monarchs, and then the milkweed for their babies to grow on. So that's kind of an interesting dimension to all of this. But these are all declining as well. And the Xerces Society is an insect society that promotes similar things, like growing the plants that are going to help the environment. And they're named after a butterfly that went extinct in San Francisco. I think it was in the 1920s, our first extinction. So we're trying to save the rest of these guys from that fate. And then we have all these native bees. I did not know this. I can't believe it because I was sleeping through biology, I think. Yeah, I'd maybe seen a bumblebee and I noticed the European honeybees, but we have 1,600 native bees in California. And the biggest concentration of those bees is actually down at Pinnacles. So if you want your kids to see a lot of different bees and take pictures of them, go to Pinnacles. And they co-evolved just like the butterflies with the native plants. They thrive in gardens where there are a lot of native plants. And they're more efficient pollinators than honeybees. Honeybees are actually really good at getting pollen for them to take back to their hives. A lot of these are solitary bees, and they're collecting some pollen to feed their babies that might be in a nest in the ground or in wood, or help me out, wood, ground. They nest in a variety of places. Okay, anyway, but these bees have a wide variety of specializations as well. So just very, very quickly, in the upper left is a bumblebee that's in a poppy. To the right of it is a carpenter bee that's a really good pollinator if you are growing tomatoes and things like that. It's pictured here with blue witch, which looks a lot like some of those flowers you'd see on a tomato plant or potato plant. And so if you're growing a native plant garden, but you're also doing a vegetable garden, bringing these native plants in to attract these bees can really help you. We've got a green sweat bee in the middle, and we have kind of famously a mason orchard bee. I don't know if you guys have heard about orchard bees or mason bees. Yeah, they're realizing that they're native. If they encourage them for the orchards, they're less susceptible to disease than the imported honeybees, which aren't as adapted to our environment. So honeybees, this is an interesting fact. Honeybees were actually brought over by the colonists back in the day in the 1600s for honey and for pollination. But because they are like cattle, they're not a native. They're governed by the USDA, and all of these bees are governed by Fish and Wildlife. So they're like, it's almost like honeybees are cows, and then these are the deer, is the way I kind of map it in my mind. It's such a fascinating thing, but these all are great pollinators. What I find really fascinating is there's something called dimorphism. So the upper right is the female valley carpenter bee. She's about the size of your thumb. Down on the lower left corner, I should put them next to each other, is her husband. I'm sorry, I anthropomorphize these things, but anyway, adorable. And if you see these in your garden, the males are stingerless. And so the male could, sorry, I'm getting carried away here. The male, you can actually pick them up and hold them, and they're called teddy bear bees, and kids love to hold them. So something to keep in mind. And then down below here, this is pretty rare, but this is right in Palo Alto. This is a petal cutter bee. So there are leaf cutter bees that cut leaves and make their nests, and then some cut petals, like this one has done on a native Clarkia. So if you grow the native plants, with each native plant I've added to my garden, I'm seeing different bees come. And the birds, of course. So we have hundreds of birds. I think we have a bird handout back there. But there's so many birds here in the Bay Area, and 96% of them, not the shorebirds, but the terrestrial birds you see in your garden, rely on caterpillars and insects to feed their young. So, and so they really thrive in these native environments. They also really thrive with the native plants. So that toyon up there that the robin is eating, that's a really healthy choice for them. But when robins, or especially cedar waxwings, eat from heavenly bamboo, that has berries as well. The cedar waxwings are gorge feeders, so they'll eat a lot of it, and it has cyanide, and so it can impair or even kill them. So, you know, in our garden, we just ripped out, we did have a lot of heavenly bamboo, we ripped all that out and we put in toyon, and it's thriving, and it's a much better choice for the birds. And then in the lower left here, this hummingbird is enjoying the native California fuchsia, which is just a gangbuster plant. I planted one because I was just testing it out. And a hummingbird came and drank from all 12 blossoms in my garden. And then it flew over right in my face. And I swear it said, plant more. So now we have 8 of those plants and they're really spreading out. And the hummingbirds just zoom around and there's so much nectar. And I went out to clean a hummingbird feeder. You're supposed to clean those every 3 days in summer. I'm way too lazy for that. So just plant a lot of these hummingbird plants and they will zip around and enjoy them. And then here is a western bluebird, which we're seeing in our neighborhood for the first time. We're in the 3rd year of our native garden. I didn't take this picture, but this is what we're seeing. They're eating the caterpillars from our garden. So, in the US, we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. That's from the number that we should be at. There are some stats about how many birds we lose each year, but just as a constant, we really need to bring them back and provide them with food for their babies. And then the other native species. So these are actually pictures that were either the ladybug was taken in a neighborhood garden. The raccoon was nesting in our tree. We had 3 baby raccoons move in when we started native gardening because there were different things for them to rummage around and eat. They were orphaned and it was really sweet. They were an age where they could forage for themselves. They could eat the acorns we left on the ground. And I didn't know this, but I was sitting, we have a little cafe area you'll see later. I was sitting there and they got in, their tummies were full and they got in the tree and they purr. If you knew that I didn't know that about raccoons, but they purr. So it seemed like the whole garden was purring with contentment, as I listened to them. I know it sounds really funny, but I mean, all these other species are fed by having the native plants. And I was surprised to learn that spiders are the #2 food source after caterpillars for the birds. So you want everything crawling around in your garden. And I mention this because there's really good news here that we have thousands, hundreds, even thousands of resilient California native plants. And this gives you power, whether you have a big garden or a small one, or just a balcony, you can do something to fight back against climate change. And I just pulled up Berkeley last night because I threw this slide in last night. And it shows that there's 816 native to here. Like if this building wasn't here, there's 816 different things that would be growing like in this area generally. And you can look those up on this website. I have a link at the end, and you can kind of search, and you can even narrow it down by your particular area. But you're not limited to that. I mean, a lot of the native plants that grow in Southern California also feed things here. So I just, as a minimum, there's a lot to choose from. So I think it's good to start with, I'm doing the hard sell on your own gardens, but think about your garden space. I hadn't really looked at my garden before and thought about, where is it shady? Where is it sunny? So when I started planting native plants during COVID, could not get anyone to come out and help design it. I offered to pay people to design it. I couldn't get a designer that I wanted. So we just did it. I made mistakes. I put some things in the shade that prefer sun. So I always try to let people know, like, at least split those areas in your mind of where is it really sunny or shady. But, and these are just local examples, but if you think about where's the sun, where are the wet areas, I know it's kind of rare here, but you might have some. What kind of soil do you have? Is it kind of clayish? Anyway, think about your garden. And then I love to use the example of my own garden because I hate to pick on anybody else, right? But this is my garden from 2007 until 2020. So we had this is what was given to us: the lawn, the box hedge, the Japanese maples. We had some Japanese Hibiscus, I can't think of the name, Sarcocoa. We had some different plants. We did have an oak tree. Its roots were being crushed by stones. And we had a gardener come mow and blow. So lots of noise and disruption. And we take all the nutrients the tree would drop and all of those little life forms and we would send it off to the dump to create methane. So that's not an very environmental thing to do. So that was our garden before. And then we heard the good word of Doug Tallamy and we got really inspired. So he's a dangerous man. If you watch that video, you've been warned. The Japanese maples were planted too close to the house. That was a really easy thing to take out with our sister-in-law insurance agent there chopping away. She was happy to help us do that. And those rains, the rainy season is the best time to start native gardening because the ground is working with you. The plants that you plant will put their roots down deep, some as deep as the height of this room or more. They'll really go deep. And so in those January rains that we had year before last, where everyone was like hiding from the floods, we were actually out in the rain and we were digging up that box hedge and it took us an afternoon. It wasn't really, we took breaks. And then because, I might have had a glass of wine on the night that was the deadline to put your garden on the garden tour. And Brian goes to bed early, so he missed out on this decision making. I just signed us up to be on the tour. And I thought either he's gonna be really mad in the morning, or we're gonna be inspired to be on a garden tour and have people come look at our garden and it'll light a fire under us. And it, thank God, was that. We got inspired. So the picture down here of me night gardening is because it's winter and it's dark at 5 and I work full time. And so sometimes you just have to resort to night gardening because that was also the night before the committee was coming to judge whether we'd be on the tour or not. So the next step after all of that was to do some design. And I put this up because I want people to feel really confident that you can do this yourself. I'm not a great artist. I got the dimensions all off on that oak. It actually covers like triple the space I put it down there, but get out a sketch pad, sketch out some ideas and think about your garden in terms of zones or plant communities. So the book on the upper left, which I have for you to browse here, the book on the upper left talks about different plant communities. So if you have an oak tree, you're gonna want its dry shade. If you water that in the summer, you're gonna wind up getting a fungus. It might fall over on your house. So you wanna be really careful about watering oaks. So for the oak, I kind of figured out what plants would work with that. And the way I did that was look in that book, look at oak woodland, look at some of those plants, and then lay them out under the oak. Did they all do great? No. The no-mow lawn idea that I had, it really was not a great idea. And so we went with verbena, which is really fragrant and beautiful instead. So experiment a little bit. You're gonna laugh. If you saw my garden, literally, it's the size of this room. So when I talk about here, the, lower area, cafe garden, I mean, this is a space like the size of this table. I mean, it's small, but you know, you can lay out even in a small garden, a little cafe area, a little special rock we have, a little courtyard, and you can start to design your area and you can start to plant for those areas. The courtyard garden on toward the street is very hot. It's like chaparral. It's manzanita land and it's like sage and all that type of stuff. So it's not sheltered by the oak and it's still summer dry. But anyway, be creative. And then you can call somebody up. People think, oh, I have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to get a designer and a crew and whatever. You can call somebody up and pay them a couple $100 to just come, walk your property, tell you what to do, maybe sketch something out, and you can do it. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So, and then I really recommend going on tours, whether they're online or virtual or reality. I'm really excited about the garden tour this weekend that's coming up over here. So we're gonna pack a picnic and we're just gonna do it all. I wanna just point out before I move to the next slide, the middle book there is considered like the Western garden book of native plants. It talks about all the plants that are really best for gardens and are what are gonna do best in that kind of environment and a lot of details about them. And then the wildlife habitat garden tells you how to pull some different elements together. There's a lot of inspiration there. So, and then get to know the plants. So these are some of the plants. I'll go through them kind of quickly because you can always refer back to this. But these are the ones that do well in sun and some will do well in partial shade. It's not an absolute. So for instance, you have manzanitas up at the top. That's an manzanita with berries. And I took that picture because the birds actually really love eating those berries and they stay on the plant for a long time. So you have a nice food source over time. Below that is an elderberry. And that also is a really good, it's also called Sambucus mexicana. But that's another one that's really good for the birds and the bees because the blooms are really popular with the bees. You get a lot of pollinators on that one. It is so easy to grow. I planted one December 28th because it's on my phone. It was about this high. And now it's this high, and that's how many months? I don't know, pretty fast. Brian's scared. He thinks it's kind of big fat spot. Anyway, we'll see. And then we have our own cherry, and it's not a great cherry for eating. It's not like a Bing cherry. It's mostly stone and with a little bit of flesh around it. The native people thought it was fine because it's all the cherry they had. But I noticed at one park near us that in the heat of summer, when everything was parched, the different bees and wasps were puncturing it and we're drinking the fluid out of it. And the birds eat them year round. Again, the flowers are great for pollinators. So those are some of the trees and shrubs that you can grow Other shrubs that are really great, toyon, that I mentioned earlier, we're growing a lot of that in our garden. I think we put in 6 or 8 of them in our backyard alone. It comes in a gold variety as well that came out of Davis. So if you're going with a certain color scheme and red's not your thing, we're going big on the red because it's like, it gets berries at Christmas time. In fact, they thought the first settlers or whatever out here thought that they were hollies. And so Hollywood is called, there was a lot of toyon. So when they saw Hollywood, they thought, oh, look at all that holly, but it was toyon. And then down below is manzanita again, just looking a little different in blossom. It blooms at a great time of year. It's like January and the bumblebees emerge at the same time. And it's the first food that they can forage, the first nectar. And they do an interesting thing to get pollen out of it, whole separate talk there, but they hang and they kind of disengage their wings and they do this thing called buzz pollination and the pollen just explodes out of it. We're growing a lot of manzanita and it's very similar in form to our blueberries. So they do the same thing on our blueberries. So that's a nice complement for a regular garden. And then the sage. Sage is foolproof. If you have a brown thumb, plant sage in the sun, you're not gonna have any problems. I mean, even if you forget to water it. Ceanothus, this is a little bit of a confusing slide because I have 2 pictures of ceanothus in blue. There are white and even gold varieties. And then I also have a coyote brush down there on the lower left. That is a tough as nails plant as well for full sun. And so you see it growing by the freeway, you see it growing in a crack of cement, but the birds love it for nesting in, for protection, for having a place to hide. And what I'm showing here is the quote, female variety that gets a lot of, it'll look like it's snowing in your garden in December if you get the female one. Most nurseries, I think, sell the male type that has a little, it's not as likely to get seeds all over your yard and it's almost like growing a sterile plant that way. So depends on how much coyote brush you want. And then buckwheats. I didn't even know about this plant for a long time. But buckwheats and again, a lupin. But there's sulfur in the lower left. You see that all over Tahoe. If you go up at the right time of year, you see it growing up in the hills. Sulfur buckwheat. Above it is that red flowered buckwheat. To the right of it is just California buckwheat. It looks very innocuous. When you're driving along on the freeway, once you get to know the plant, you're like, oh, there it is. But it just looks like a shrubby California plant over there. I did a lot of work in a pollinator garden, the Primrose Way pollinator garden in Palo Alto. It's a mouthful. And she said that she's a very accomplished and pretty famous landscape architect. And she said buckwheats of all the plants, they're like a disco on a Saturday night. She said that every kind of insect goes to the buckwheat. All of the birds can eat the seeds. You leave the seed heads on there as long as they're viable. And it is a very popular plant with the insects and birds. And then lupin is another one. There are certain butterflies that only will only have their caterpillars eat lupin. It's a beautiful plant that you might see blooming. It's blooming on my side of the bay. I guess you probably see it over here a lot too. So that's a good, I suggested silver lupin because it's perennial, but there are annual types as well. And then here are a bunch of annuals. Just we have our own sunflower on the upper left. We have the California fuchsia that the hummingbirds will order more from you. My grandson Charlie took the picture of those poppies just at a pollinator garden on the lower left. And then this is something called tidy tips. And this is a little small bowling, on the tidy tips. So you'll see a lot more insects in the garden and a lot more life as a result. And then in shade, a lot of us have shady areas. And I'm not talking about redwood shade. That's kind of a different, you can look to that design book for redwood specific. But if you have kind of dappled shade, then these are a lot of the plants that do really well in that environment. So we have on the upper left there, we have monkey flower. To the right of it is cream bush. To the lower left is a type of ribes, a native currant with a beautiful pink pendulous blooms. That blooms about the same time as the manzanita. So people walk by your garden kind of in the dead of winter and go, oh, what's that? You know, it's really eye-catching. And then to the right of that, I call this gooseberry here naughty but nice. Because if you look in the upper right of this lower picture, there's a thorn like the length of my pinky finger there. It's a very thorny bush. And we tend to avoid things that are thorny or prickly or whatever because we don't like them, but they provide protection to the birds. And this particular plant is very popular with hummingbirds with those beautiful pendulous pink flowers, as is the currant. And it's also a nice plant, going back to the Primrose Way garden. Juanita said that she likes to plant this. There were a bunch of workmen who had a paved area where they could have their cigarettes and tramp around on stuff when they were repairing the electrical box. But they would go and trample and smoke in the garden and drop cigarette butts and kill the plants. And so she just planted some of this gooseberry right there. There's an area where you don't want dogs, or, you know, somebody joked, or under your teenage daughter's window, so no boys, you know, like you can be creative with the thorns. I only weed under that thing once a year anyway. I have a lot of mulch. It gets a little bit of grass. I put on the gloves, I go in, you know, and actually that's where I found that really cool caterpillar. So, you know, don't be afraid of thorns and thistles and things like that. They're really awesome. Here are some of my really favorite shade plants. We have a lot of shade under that oak. And on the upper left is coffeeberry. I show a close-up of the berries, again, emphasizing that for birds. But it can make a really beautiful mound. There's one, East Bay Wilds has one that's called Mount Vision. That's actually like a perfect shape, and the pollinators especially love. But there's one called EUK sits in the nursery trade. There's some of them can get very big. So you want to talk to a nursery about, you know, what kind of size you want. But they also do well in sun. I said full sun too, because they really are versatile that way. To the right of that is huckleberry, and those are tasty. Those are like, we had those all over the Northwest when we lived in Seattle. And so you can eat them yourself, or you can have them for the birds. That's a little bit slow growing, likes shade, and likes a little bit of damp. So you gotta, you know, if you're already watering a corner of your yard, then maybe plant that native over there with the watered stuff. Lower left is a rare plant, very rare now in out in the world, but the nursery trade has picked it up. And so that's a Nevins barberry. That gives you berries in the heat of summer, in the middle of summer. So the toyons were in the winter. Now you have berries in the summer. Again, kind of prickly leaves, and it's related to the Oregon grape here, which a lot of you might be familiar with on the right, which I'm just showing in bloom, but it gets little purple grape looking things. It's not really a grape, but it's a berberis, it's Latin name. But those are really great plants, again, to have like in a little corner of your yard where you're not going to brush into them. And then ground covers, and these are just a few. Like I said, you've got 800 plants to choose from just for your own area. But native strawberries, there's a woodland one for the shade. There's a beach one for sunny areas. Somebody gave me some free ones before I knew what I was doing. And so they were beach, but they got planted in shade. They're doing great. So, you know, experiment. To the right of that is, again, manzanita with the berries, but that's a really low growing. You've heard of kinnikinnick maybe? And that's actually something found all over the world. That's native to a lot of places, which is unusual. So that makes a nice ground cover. It's not the kind of ground cover you're going to go play soccer on, but you know, it's a nice, creates a nice low profile. To the bottom left, have you heard of yerba buena before? Does that sound familiar? What do you know about, do you know anything about it?
I just have looked into plants that we could, so like someone mentioned it.
Yeah, it's kind of like in the mint family, or has mint qualities. It's edible. And somebody said people use it to make mojitos. You can actually kind of make a pretty nice mojito out of it, but it creates a really nice carpet in a shady spot. So it's a really nice, pretty plant. And then yarrow, my own yarrow, I have a variety that gets really tall flower heads, and it doesn't look as dense and ferny as this. But again, if you wanted that effect, you could talk to a nursery person about the right one to get. So definitely check out that yarrow. And then vines, these are just a few of them. But again, we have honeysuckle. We had a beautiful fragrant Chilean jasmine next to our front door, but I noticed 0 insects used it, not even the bees, not even the butterflies would get nectar from it. So we replaced that with honeysuckle, which the hummingbirds love, and it gets little berries for the birds. And then below that is the pipevine. You guys have a lot of the pipevine swallowtails over here. We don't get those on my side, but I think if you plant that pipevine, you'll probably get some in your garden, those beautiful blue butterflies. And then here are, again, more perennials for shade. So the asters, those are foolproof. To the right of that is what's something called bee plant. It looks really innocuous to us humans, but those little tiny flowers must have the most concentrated nectar, because the hummingbirds and the bees fight over those little tiny flowers. On the lower left is hummingbird sage. It's a rare type of, it's not a rare plant. It's rare that a sage thrives in shade, and that's a good one for a shady spot. And then on the bottom right is goldenrod. And then here are some shade annuals. So you can get these in a pack of annuals. We have some seeds in the back that are perennials, but the company Larner Seeds does sell also a shade mix. So you can get those as well. And then don't forget grasses. I always kind of overlook this area. I'm like, oh, grasses aren't my thing. But it turns out the bees really like to nest in the roots of the grasses, and the grasses also serve as like a sponge. So we have an area near our house that's kind of, the water runs off and it's kind of a damp spot, and we're gonna put in a little swale there with some stones and plant the grasses around it, because the grass roots, like I said, they go really deep and they absorb water. And they're starting to do this more and more in places that flood, as the water's coming down the hills of San Carlos and trying to flood the lower areas of San Carlos. Along the way, they're planting more and more native grasses to absorb that water, and more swales, indentations in gardens to catch it. And then nuts, we don't think about this as being a California thing except for the acorns. So we have acorns. We also have a native hazelnut in the middle there that you can grow. That's it inside of a little sheath. When it ripens, it actually looks just like a hazelnut you get at the store. And then wax myrtle, I don't know if that counts as a nut, but it's a very hard little seed, but the birds love all of these, and the squirrels and other things eat them too. So what does it look like when you put it together? Well, when you plant in layers like this, where you have some low plants like this buckwheat in the foreground, and you have a little bit of a false golden aster on the left, you have some penstemon over further out, and you have the currant back there behind the bird bath. It's not in bloom with pink blooms right now, but it's a nice little bush for the birds to hop down into the bird bath with. And the thing I like to point out about this garden is you see where the window is. It looks to us like it's behind a bush, but actually the window's looking out on the whole garden. And so when you're building a garden like this, think about where you're sitting, what you're looking at, what you might see. Whoops, skipped over. Here's another perspective of a garden with more of the hot plants, exposed plants like the poppies and the buckwheats, and a little chair to sit and enjoy it all. So when you think about designing, think about how you're going to interact with the space. And then here's another example of someone who's really planted in these lush layers. This garden's actually in Fremont. It's Joel Lim's garden, Lym, and I believe he's on the tour again this year. So you can actually go see it in person and get some ideas. And this plant, what's interesting thing about this redbud, there's an eastern redbud that doesn't feed our native species, and there's an almost identical western redbud that does. So that's a western redbud. And if you go to buy a redbud, just double check the label. It's amazing how many nurseries will put an eastern redbud in the native section, and it's not native to here. And then I had mentioned even a tiny space like our little cafe area. You know, you can put a little table, you can have a little bird bath, you can have, these are the coffee berries in the foreground here that are feeding actually the most insects in our entire garden. The coffee berries are really getting a lot of little bites on the leaves and little things wrapping themselves up and going into chrysalis. And what you don't see over to the right is the huge oak tree, and we have some other flowers planted under that I list here. And then going up the fence, we're starting to work on the pipeline growing up there to see if we can reintroduce that butterfly to our area. Working with a lepidopterist over here to see if we can, I want to get a lot going up and down our creek and here if I'm going to attempt that. And then we have the woodland strawberry on the ground that you can't see. And there's native irises also around the bird bath. So you can make a really lovely small space. Or if you don't even have that much space, if you only have a balcony, you can get some tall pots because the native plants like deep roots. So I'd say like waist high or more. And you can put in that's a little manzanita in the background there. There's a little monkey flower spilling out over the side. In the foreground is a penstemon. To the left of it is something called false golden aster. But you can kind of play with this. If something dies, I know we all feel bad and we feel like we're a bad gardener, but we should put that aside and we should think about, like, I used to get bouquets at Trader Joe's that maybe cost like $13 or $18, just like one of these plants. And these plants also die out in nature. So we just got to experiment and we've got to let go of any failings that happen along the way. And then I do water the pots because those plants can't put down their roots as deep as this room. You need to water them a little more regularly, like every couple of weeks, probably in the summer. And then provide shelter in your garden. So as you're thinking about gardening, I think a lot of us were raised with the expectation, oh, you got to go tidy up, you got to go prune everything, et cetera. You don't actually have to do that. So you can let things kind of be wild, or you can prune when the birds are done nesting. And you don't want to expose the nest to like cats or rain or different elements. And then leave the leaves. I was talking about this earlier. We used to scrape them off and send them off to make methane. Now that we're leaving the leaves, we're actually, weeding is easier. the water, the ground stays moist, the clay soil is being broken up. There's all sorts of insects in there. In fact, I took some Girl Scouts through the garden. We were like digging through the leaves and finding all the things that we could find in there. And it's kind of fun, like, that's more interesting to me than a lawn. I feel like I need a lawn for my kids. Maybe you just need a pile of leaves decomposing for the kids to rummage through. So, and also about not being too tidy, in the middle on the left, that's a chrysalis. It's now I'm trying to remember if it actually is the morning cloak that it's next to. But that chrysalis looks like a dead leaf or something that you would probably prune off accidentally. So try to be a little bit of a messy gardener and all of this wildlife will thrive. And this is a picture from our, actually from Brian's window where he works. We're starting to see a lot more bird diversity in our garden. So we didn't have the western bluebirds before. I don't remember seeing the goldfinches. The house finches are pretty ubiquitous, so we saw a lot of them before, but we also see our oak tree is at full capacity. All of the holes in it are now occupied with little bush tits and oh my goodness, nuthatches and the western bluebird. And so we put up birdhouses and immediately those were occupied as well because we have enough food on our small lot for all of them to feed their babies. And I have a little thing here about bird bath care because I've seen such conflicting information about it. But the bottom line is that soap breaks down the oil in birds' wings, and you want to try to avoid even a residue of that. And bleach gets into their gut biome. As we're learning now, we all have gut biomes. So you just want a little bit of vinegar, which is something that happens in nature anyway. Just a little splash. I scrub it out with a little brush. Do that about once a week. The plants around there haven't minded so far, a little bit of acid. So that's worked really well for us. And then this probably goes without saying to this crowd, but but try to avoid any pesticides or herbicides. I've never used them. I've never felt that I had to. And they're really bad for our health. I read more and more studies about the effect of herbicides and pesticides on human health, but also it's becoming really ubiquitous. So they're using 26 times the number of pesticides that they used 20 years ago today. So the usage is really up. And neonicotinoids are especially ubiquitous. Anything you buy at Home Depot, you can probably assume has that on it. And it poisons the leaves. And then anything visiting the plant could be poisoned. So, or if you're eating that as your food, like gross stuff from organic seed is my advice, but it's just really any opportunity you have to protest against those, I recommend protesting because I think we could all be healthier if we did. So going back to a positive note. So this is our garden now. You remember it was lawn and box hedge. And so now it's all of those are moonglow poppies along the front, which when they die back, the epilobium comes up. We have sage, we have manzanita, coffeeberry, we have all of these plants. And the garden not only provides food for all of those different creatures, but it's really low maintenance. Like we weed pretty much like right before the garden show every year. I might pluck out a weed here or there that I might see, but because of all the mulch and all the leaves, it's very suppressed. So that's been really easy and it's resilient. So when people say, oh, I've got this disease or that disease on my plants, it's pretty rare that we see anything wrong with the plants. And when you talk about pests, well, the intention is for the plant to be eaten so that I don't have a pest problem either, because that's all just bird food. And so your garden can look like this. As I mentioned, the birds will be happier, the hummingbirds will be happier, you'll see more bee diversity. And I do want to talk about very, very quickly how much water you can save, because that bottom line in blue is the precipitation in California. It's very low in the summer. We aren't a Mediterranean climate, we're a Mediterranean dry climate. That's very rare. So that's not Sydney, Australia, where my brother lives, and that's not parts of Italy where they get monsoon rains in the summer. Or they have heat and wet at the same time of year. That doesn't happen here. When we have heat, we don't have wet. So really the best time to start native gardening is in November, December, January, February, get stuff into the ground, get it established. If you're growing, quote, drought tolerant plants, like the ones from Sydney, Australia, where my brother is, then it's going to be that yellow arc in summer of water needs. And so it may be drought tolerant, but you're still going to need supplemental water. And if you're growing a lawn, as we used to, no judgment here, then you're going to be watering a lot. And you're not only watering a lot, but your lawn is part of the 40 million acres of lawn in the United States. That's our biggest crop in the entire US. It doesn't feed humans and it doesn't feed animals or insects either. So we got rid of ours. Again, some people have to have that lawn and maybe just minimize less of it. So, anyway, and landscape irrigation is half of the annual residential water consumption. So why take a 2-minute shower when you could just stop watering your yard? And then beyond this, I'm kind of winding up now, get out there and learn more, go on a garden tour. So I said this weekend with an exclamation point, go check out the Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour. You can sign up. You can go to 2 houses. You can go to 20 houses. So those are the dates for that. And then next year, you can come over to our side. In April, we have a garden tour over on the other side of the bay. It's not that far. Not on a weekday evening, but on a weekend, it's not that far.
Are we signing up again?
Oh, yes, dear. And I promised to, because this is a school, I included some talking points about gardening with children or getting them excited about habitat gardening. So you can visit natural places, learn about the wildlife. You can take pictures and especially have the kids take pictures. My grandson Charlie here, he's out helping us clean up one of the pollinator gardens in Palo Alto. And I let him wear my vest, you know, so he felt really empowered there. But kids feel a sense of, I think they pick up on this overriding sense of gloom and doom about where we are right now. And this is a way that they can feel empowered, like they're making a difference. The kids don't have much opportunity to earn money, so I paid them to stuff seed packets for me. So there they are, and I got them to actually smile while they were doing it, so that was a feat, teenagers. But these are also great things for science projects. There's so much here that kids can use for science, et cetera. And I have some field trip ideas that's a sort of a crowdsource thing. So if you have ideas, add them. And then I show my other grandson here going out to nurseries with us. We bribe them with lunch and whatever. They get to pick some of the plants. Or putting seeds and little books in around Christmas time. We put them out in the little libraries in our area. And my grandson Charlie would wrap them up as we were driving in the car. And then we would pull up and he'd pop them in the box. And I think we did like a dozen of those. The books are only, the National Geographic books are like $5. And then we did, I had 23 Girl Scouts come over. I gotta tell you, this was a coup in itself because when you start native gardening, if you leave the leaves and your plants haven't started blooming beautifully yet, you kind of get the stink eye from the neighbors. They're like, what are you doing? Are you lazy? Yes, I am. But all that aside, I'm leaving the leaves for a purpose. But one of the neighbors, when she saw how it was all coming along and what we were doing, and put out some signs about that, she asked if she could bring 23 Girl Scouts over. And she said, maybe we could do a scavenger hunt. And I share this because this is a really easy thing to do, maybe even here at the school. I went out and took pictures in my own garden of things, and then I had them go find those things. And it was really simple. And I even put a link to it that you can edit and download here if you want to copy that and use it. But kids love to do this kind of stuff. I have my grandsons help me actually take some of those pictures, and even volunteering, they feel a sense of empowerment when they do these activities. And beyond your own garden, you might also get inspired to volunteer or start a native garden. The woman who started this native garden and the hat on the upper left, actually, I had a 2-hour conversation with her about joining the Wildflower Ambassadors that I head up. She said, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I'm a hermit. And then she went to the city of San Jose and she negotiated a very large swath of land. And she started this pollinator garden. And I'm like, you don't seem like a hermit to me. So I think she surprised herself, but this is a caterpillar that she's actually showing the kids in the garden. I think that was 2 weeks ago when we were there for the tour. So anyway, I just plant that seed, so to speak, in case anyone here is thinking, oh, even if there's like a little strip somewhere the size of this table, you could do something with that and it'd probably be very welcome. And here are a lot of resources. So way more than you are ever going to be able to probably read, but it took me a year to find where to buy seeds, where to buy plants, where are the links, who has the information, who are the people I should connect with, and even the books and even some videos. So I put all of this in here just so that you have something easily at hand to refer to. And I'm not going to go into all this in detail because I think I'm at time. Ooh, 3 minutes. But I do this just to make you think I'm done, okay? And if you scan the QR code, and I'll put this back up, But if you scan that, then I don't know how that works on a screen, but anyway, there's a link here as well, and you have, anyway, I'll make sure you all have links. I'll send like the original deck. But that was a little false ending, right? Because I couldn't help myself. When you download the slides, you also get these other resources like Calscape, a little bit of information about that site. You also get iNaturalist, which if you're not using it is super awesome. So there are whole talks about how to use that. Just very quickly, on the left are pictures I've taken to help me identify different things that I'm seeing in my garden or out in nature. And to the right are all of the pictures that I found to help me make slide decks like this. And if you go to a setting that just says it's non-commercial and you just have to put their name, their byline, then you can use anything. There's billions of images on Nextdoor. So, I mean, on iNaturalist. So anyway, that's a really useful one. And then we have loved having this Merlin app on our phones. We go out in our garden and there's so much more bird diversity now. I think we had 16 birds the other day that we were able to identify from that app. And that's out of the University of Cornell, which is emerging as like the world leader as a bird source, or at least the US leader in terms of ornithology. So there's lots of resources for education at their site as well. But I couldn't help myself. And then that's the Cornell site, all about birds. If you download the All About Birds app, then you can track your own bird sightings and you can be like, who was in that movie recently? Anyway, about the big year and going and finding all the birds you can find on the whole planet. There you go. There you go. You can have your own big year. So I think I couldn't help it. California Native Plant Society, I picked a couple of chapters, but you can check with others. I think the East Bay chapter also has gardening resources. And now I am really truly done. And this is who we're doing it for. We're doing it for this mother robin who has found 2 very healthy caterpillars for her babies, but also the less nutritious worm. So I always look at this picture and I'm like, which kid gets the worm and does he at least get the caterpillar next to him? So anyway, so that's it. I'm gonna go back to the questions so that if anybody didn't get my info, you're welcome to it. And do you guys have questions? Because I am, wow, that was an hour. I think I promised 45
Yeah.
minutes.
Well, let's give it a round of applause. Sure. That is so inspiring. Yeah, questions.
We have a thank you from the audience just for sharing your knowledge and giving us all their resources.
Oh, thanks.
So Zoom folks, if
Hi,
you wanna
audience.
pop off, we have some claps here.
Oh, I gotta wait that way, sorry. Okay.
But feel free to
Yeah.
ask questions, just come off the mic if you have them, or if you put them in the chat, I'll get them for you. Turn on.
Mike has a question.
To start, yeah, I came with this one and you mentioned California natives that are not necessarily native to our part of California.
Right.
And how that's okay. I plan to ask you that coming in because,
Yeah.
you know, we have a really nice Western red bud in our front yard and I felt really happy about that. And then I went on Calscape and I looked it up
Oh,
and it's not native to the East Bay. It's more like foothills,
right,
mountains. And I thought,
right.
okay, is it still feeding local wildlife?
Right, and I think that there's a whole range. I used to work at an ethics center, so it's like there's all this gray area, you know. So I think one thing is some people talk about ecotyping to your exact area. So not only a plant that you got at some nursery in California and you brought here and planted, but that you go to a nursery that's grown it out from something that's been here all along. Like Native Here Nursery, I think is kind of dedicated to that, the CNPS nursery here. I believe Watershed Nursery as well, at least they're growing things out from seed. And ecotyping, and I think that that's at the far end of the precision, okay? And I think there are merits to that, because if you're talking about coevolution, the insects probably haven't moved too far, and there may be subtleties in the plants we don't understand. And so in an ideal world, we would do that. But I had somebody ding me once for buying these seeds from Bolinas and buying milkweed that's native to here, the narrowleaf milkweed from Bolinas, because it's not ecotyped to here. And I'm like, well, I'm trying to give out a lot of seeds to a lot of people to get them started with native gardens. And would we rather have 0 milkweeds? I can't get ecotype to every single area I go to in bulk. Like, can I get a pound of milkweed from here? Probably not. So it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge. And I think my own feeling is the ship has kind of sailed. I mean, we are at a crisis point. We have from Doug Tellemy's estimation as an entomologist, we have 16 years to solve this, and we need to take the native plants that we can grow that are gonna feed things. Your redbud will get leafcutter bees coming. You'll see little, I call it use not damage. You'll see little holes, you'll see little circles. If you see half circles in your leaves, the leafcutter bees are building nests with that, and you have contributed to the biodiversity here. And other bees will use the flowers, so even if you don't see leafcutters, you'll get use out of the plants. So I tend to be a little more liberal, and I even say some plants are native even to Southern California, some of the buckwheats that are really beautiful. The birds eat the seeds, the insects use the plant. I'm personally not a purist about it, and I do have a lavender and a Mexican sage and a camellia I'm not really in love with, but it's a bird perch right now. I have a couple plants that aren't native still in my garden. I'm not even an absolutist about native versus not native, but try to build as much biodiversity as you can. And it's really rewarding. I mean, it got really easy after the first couple of plants because we started planting stuff and seeing action. And then we're like, well, that box edge is doing nothing. And actually we tore it out. It was doing nothing. On the far corner of it, in a shady corner, a salamander was living under it. And we put another shrub right over there. We put a little sign that says salamander house next to it. And the neighborhood kids, they'll be riding their bikes by. Don't think kids don't notice. They're riding their bikes and they look over and they see that and go, they like stop their bike. They're like salamander house. And it's like, but it is. And there's an anthill. And there's like, if you label not just the plants, but the users of the plants, the residents, and these creatures were here before us, sometimes by millions of years. I was looking up, I want to do a timeline of like, how many millions of years have there been squirrels? How many millions of years have there been? The butterflies actually evolved in North America. They evolved here. So, anyway, sorry, soapbox. More questions, yes.
Why did you say 16 years?
Oh, earlier in the slide deck, we were talking about the insect decline. It's been pretty dramatic. And with the global increase in pesticides, the global development, we've lost about half of our insect species in a decade, 46%. So they're saying we're gonna we won't have no insects, but we might hit a point where we don't have enough pollinators to sustain humans. Some people like to argue we can get technology to do that. The Chinese are developing electronic bees that will fly around. Not to the billions and billions of numbers that we have, or the efficiency, or all of the other side benefits. So I feel like we just have to fight for this. And my grandson, one of them, he's 16 now, he's a little more jaded. He's like, oh, Judy, you just love these plants. I go, I'm not doing it for the plants. The plants are fodder to me for caterpillars. And I said, I don't even care about the caterpillars because they're just fodder for the birds. I said, I don't even care about the birds because they're just part of an ecosystem that ultimately leads to you. I care about you. So he's like, every now and then, you can tell a teenager something and they go, oh, so I'm not a big, but now some people are really into the plants, and I respect that, but yeah, but thanks for asking. And you can download the whole deck and go through all of that, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I have a blog, which I'm terrible at keeping up, but somebody recommended recently. I have done different talks like pollinators, birds, whatever. I'll put that up there as soon as I have a chance. But go on the tour this weekend. Yeah.
I have a question. If we like to plant, vegetables,
Yeah.
we don't have a lot of space
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Between vegetables and native plants, should we go with native plants
Right.
and buy our vegetable in local farms? for
Right,
example? What would
right.
be
That's
your
such a
choice?
dilemma, because
Yeah.
I have a blueberry bush and I love my blueberries that I grow, right? They're extra good.
Mhm.
But if I see a bird eating them, Brian usually eats the birds. He gets out there and he gets me a couple of blueberries, but I feel like they can't go to a grocery store and I can. But I also recommend thinking creatively, like, can you do both? Can you have like your raised bed for your vegetables and then have like, your blueberry bush and then your manzanita, or like, can you grow some things together or some things that they say with native plants, will it tolerate water? I love that term, right? Because like the default is not watering. So if you're watering something, then think about that. But I don't know, can you go up a fence? Well, we have a big fence along our driveway. So I was thinking of growing cucumbers there because it's a little bit shady too, but I don't know. Do you have room to do a little bit of that?
I have beds where I put
Yeah,
vegetables.
yeah.
So.
But maybe some native plants in tall pots. They're very pretty. I mean, I did it, even though we have some land, I did it just so that my front yard, the courtyard didn't look so flat. It gave it some a bright red little pop of color, you know, so you can think that. I feel like I see a question bubbling over your
Not a
head.
question, I just want to say thank you so much. When we moved to Berkeley like last year, I asked, to create another local native nursery called Oak Town.
Oh, yeah.
Them, and they have like a class like this, it's a public nursery, like this is exactly what I was looking
Yeah,
for. I know
yeah.
there's plenty of information out there, but it can be a
It's
lot,
to
so
find it.
this is awesome. Thanks.
And there's conflicting information. So one of the earliest videos I saw said that creating berms, you know, like we create a berm like the height of that table, just around our courtyard. First off, we wanted to give a little jump on the height. Like if you plant a manzanita down here, then you have people on a garden tour and they're like, oh, what's, you know, this is a garden for elves, right? So I wanted a height. But one of the earliest videos I saw said, oh, burning is like black reference of a scoundrel, and people like it's a way to cheat or something like that. Well, subsequently I learned most people think, no, California is hilly and lots of drainage, and there's, burning is a good strategy, you know, so we also have to like, check out a lot of sources.
But you're fortunate here because you have a lot of access to a lot of great, nurseries. So,
Yeah.
that one you mentioned, East Bay Wild, that's Green by you. You have Watershed over in Richmond. I mean, there's some really, new journey over here all the time by plants, so.
And these has,
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, they do, yeah,
You mentioned that you kept some of your previous plants that are not native.
you're right.
So what is the ratio? Like if we were to keep some big trees that are not native, that have been there for like 60+ years,
Yeah,
like what do you do if
oh,
you want to keep some of the plants that
Right.
are not native, and so what would be the ratio to make it
Right.
thrive?
yeah, Doug Tellamy said 70% native is the goal. Like if we can do that, then, you know, we're, I guess, absolved of any other sins. I have in our backyard, I forgot to mention, I have a huge 60-foot pine. Liquid amber, it's also called gum. Most truth, the little sticky chichi balls. The squirrels love it. The birds love it. I've been told, we planted some trees around it. I've been told by Pete at East Bay Wilds, it does suck up a lot of nutrients, so it's competing with those plants that I put in. So it's kind of I call it an ethical dilemma. But so far, most people I've talked to are like, leave it, you know, and people we have, in addition to our front yard, which has the oak and it has that sort of chaparral area, our backyard backs onto a seasonal creek. So the creek runs in the winter, but then it dries up in the summer, but the water is still way down there. So we get a whole bunch of different opportunities there. So people along that creek who have bought houses recently have knocked down some of the really big oaks like as big around as this room almost. I don't know how they got away with it. 'Cause it's supposed to not be illegal. On a huge bay the bees were living in. But we're kind of going into those areas. So I don't want to take out that big tree that's not native and have like nothing for the next 15 years.
But we might eventually evolve to taking it out as things fill in.
Right. So we planted some native cherries back there. There's something called a native mountain mahogany that's really beautiful. That the Native Americans would make bows and arrows out of. I meant to mention that the sambucus, the elderberry, they would make flutes out of because the stems are hollow. And my plan with those is when I trim the branches to leave part of the branch sticking out. And the bees like that pithy center to nest in. So, you know, there's a lot you can do, but we're planting along that creek. Even, you know, in the cone of silence here, even on the other side of our fence going up and down the creek, putting in some native trees to replace the ones that were taken. You know, guerrilla gardening, I shouldn't advocate that, but I don't know. Yeah, but I'm totally happy to answer other questions. I think you'll think of something when you go home, or,
Got one on Zoom.
oh, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Julie is asking, I'm curious how you manage yard waste, bigger branches and such, that's harder or takes a longer time to compost.
yes. So we've taken, because there's also something like almost a chemical warfare between the native and not native plants. So underground, they secrete different chemicals. Our plants all feed each other this native or support this native mycorrhizae that's underneath the ground. I didn't get into all of that because that'd be a longer class, but so for some of the not native plants where we had bigger branches, we did actually compost at the whatever, the dump or whatever. We did take some of that out. For the native branches, sometimes we'll have like a oak branch fall down or something like that. We just kind of shove that in the back corner of our yard. It's good for it to decompose. The insects can use it. The bees can burrow into it. Even, one of the trees that's not native that we took out, we left it standing this high. It's not gonna fall on our house if it's 5 feet high, but things can start to burrow into it and use it as housing. So that's my solution. And then we don't throw anything else away because like, we literally would have, imagine this room full, 3 feet deep with oak leaves. And when it rains, they just break down and they turn into nice soft loamy, not clay soil that we used to hit with a pickaxe. So, you know,
Our soil was so much clay, we had to use a pick in order to plant our first plants, and we also got an auger that would dig into it. And we left the leaves, and the next winter I went out and I put the shovel in and went all the way into the hills. It was like a miracle, I couldn't believe it. It was so much easier to garden. Leaving the leaves one season made all the difference.
right.
If you have any tips on finding some of these caterpillars and, you know, other insects and things, you know, once
Right.
you have the plants in the ground and they're getting nibbled on, like we planted a toy on like, it's starting to grow, and I noticed that some of the leaves have little bites taken out of them,
Yeah,
but I can't actually
Catch
find
them. you
any.
can't catch them at it, right?
Yeah, like, are there places to look or?
I know,
how do
I
you-
am terrible at this, and I'm also really terrible at photographing butterflies. You wanna hear me first? Because they flit. I mean, they were designed to like get away from birds, but, I think the more time you spend in the gardens, like we have that little cafe area, and I'll sit there very quietly, having a cup of coffee in the morning. And that's where I first noticed the hummingbird flying around the oak tree and flicking its tongue out. I'm like, there's no nectar on the oak tree. What's it doing? And that led me to look at I could see its silhouette, and it was eating bugs, it was eating gnats. And then that caused me to look up do hummingbirds eat gnats? Yes, 80% of their diet is protein from small insects. The nectar is a supplement, so the nectar is like the Slurpee at 7-Eleven, and actually they can live without it. Because they have had studies where there was real nectar scarcity, and they lived off the bugs alone.
I would
So,
say two things of your
Yeah.
point about trying to find out. One is underneath the leaves, they're quite often hiding underneath as opposed to on top. And the other thing is a lot of things happen at night. You know, we're talking about moths as opposed to butterflies and
Yeah.
things like that. A lot of them happening at night, so that could be another place where you might.
yeah.
You mentioned, you know, oh, you can always find expertise to give you quick input.
Right.
I feel like I've seen websites, but I can't quite remember like where one goes to find someone that you know will be sustainability oriented.
Right,
Local
right.
plant oriented.
Yeah, so the two, I kind of flashed them quickly, but California Native Plant Society, and there's one for the East Bay. I put because that slide was actually used in Millbrae, I used Yerba Buena and Santa Clara, but I believe the East Bay also has a gardening section on the California Native Plant Society site for the chapter. And they often list gardeners or designers for your area. And so the other source that I put up, Bringing Back the Natives, that has the garden tour this weekend. It's actually kind of fun. One thing that we did was we looked at the previews of the different houses on the site to kind of get a feel for things. And then we saw, oh, this one garden designer, you can kind of sort by who designed it. Oh, I really like her style. And so we looked at a couple of her gardens that she did. And so we were able to act and talk to people who worked with her. Because we talked to people in our neighborhood who worked with certain people who are like, oh my God, like we just argued all the time. Like they couldn't understand what I wanted. They just wanted to put in what they wanted, and I'm not happy with it. It's like, or I feel like that person ordered up all these plants and I didn't get to pick out the plants and they weren't good quality. And so I just heard so many complaints from people who didn't quite get the relationship part right. And I'm taking off my CNPS hat and covering up my name tag there. When I say CNPS as an organization doesn't like to recommend certain people, it gets political really fast. But as an individual, I'm happy to tell you about people I know on this side or on my side who I have heard good things about and I've even done a little work with. So after everything was said and done with our garden, we hired a gal. She had to come up from San Jose. We paid for her travel time. I think it was a couple $100. And she spent an hour with us. She actually spent more than an hour. She walked around our garden and then she went home and she thought about some things and she sent us like another email. So she was great. But that was really, even after everything was said and done, she could point to a few things. Oh, if you put this here, you put that there. And that's what prompted us to put like a big toyon in front of our house, you know, where it would really be a glorious spot for it. Or, you know, she looked at the ceanothus I put in the shade, which really like sun, and she's like, they're blooming, like they're surviving. They're kind of growing like this. Oh, wow, they get to live. Yeah, so I'm happy to share some, but if you go to bringingbackthenatives.net, she has a list of designers that I think have been vetted, I'll put it that way. Because over on our side, we have a company called Cal Natives, and you look at their work and they put in a mishmash of whatever, not even very well. He's a Cal Native. The guy who's doing it, he's native, but nothing that he does is native, and I see a lot of complaints about it. So, yeah. Any other questions, you're also welcome to email me. I could talk about this all day.
All the plants that are not native and you take out of the garden, just move the compost.
Yeah, that's another ethical dilemma, because when we heard the good word of Doug Tallamy, we got excited. We had just started, and I don't know why, we are California natives, and we always want to garden in November, which turns out to be the time when you're supposed to garden in California. But, you know, we were gonna do a traditional garden, we started all these seeds. I had all sorts of delphiniums and carnations, all these things I started from seed. Like, imagine like 4 tables like that of seeds started. And then we heard that, and I'm like, okay, I have a friend who's never gonna grow natives, so I just gave her some of those. And then the rest of them, I'm like, it's still not food. Like, I'm still gonna give not food away somewhere, so I just throw it away. And I feel the first time you do it, I think it hurts your heart a little bit. Like, I love Chilean jasmine, the way it smells. And I love sarcophoca, this evergreen bush that looks exactly like coffee berry, actually, but smells nice in February. I love those plants. And then I hear a little song in my head, because we're both listening to music. I used to love her, but it's all over now. You just have to sing along. I can rip it out and put something in there that you fall in
It
love
is
with.
very painful to come to a garden where somebody has had a landscape designer put in these beautiful Japanese maples
Oh,
that my friends think I'm at the San Mateo Japanese garden when I'm in my backyard
I know,
and cut them down.
yeah.
But we have, or the other thing we've done is we've stopped watering. And so things like that just die.
They
They just-
opted out.
And so it's kind of a, hey, you know, toughen up and you can stay or you're out. So it's hard to do, it really is, but
There's a
we're
lot.
looking at this kind of longer term.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and some of those trees that were great privet is not good for the environment, it's not good for the birds. A sidebar about not native berries, many of them are very high in starch. Many of the native berries are higher in protein. The birds need the protein. But when they eat the starchy stuff, again, go back to 7-Eleven, it's like they're having a nice carbo boost. They might, actually, their pigmentation will make them look like they're healthy. The house finches will look more red. Then they will mate with a female who thinks they're a really healthy male, even though he's got a bad 7-Eleven diet. And then you start to see the decline of the people. So, you know, it's really, again, it's only hard the first time. Got this ruthless. And our backyard, our front yard, we like went piece by piece by piece. Our backyard, you know, turned off the water and then we just like, I mean, it was like the December of destruction. Like, once Christmas is over, we just like took a bunch of stuff out, and it's so much fun to buy plants. I gotta tell you, like, just go, you'll make friends with the nursery people. Well, because you're spending money. But you know, you get advice from them. So anyway, and you mentioned East Bay Wilds only open on Fridays, which as a working person drove me crazy, but then take a hickey.
They're only open Friday?
They're only open on Fridays. His main income is actually doing large scale landscapes. And so most of the days he's working on that. And he likes to go camping on weekends. And so he says the nursery's kind of a break even, but he's got great stock. He's got really great stock. So I really recommend him.
So-
Brian alluded to, we come over Highway 92, we go to Oaktown, we go to East Bay Wilds, we go up to Richmond. We don't usually go to Annie's because the selection's a little more limited, so we go to Watershed instead, which is nearby, a much bigger selection, lower prices. And then we go across the Richmond Bridge to CNL Nursery, California Native Landscapes, which has more of that's where we bought some of our bigger plants or our specialty stuff. And then there's a really nice fish place, Hook Fish Company. I don't even eat fish, but they've got great, I get like a vegetarian taco there. But just beautiful outdoor space, all planted with natives. So if you're growing in containers, check out Cook Fish Company and all that area. And then we come back across the Golden Gate Bridge and go down to San Carlos. So it's a nice, fun loop. He has the beer, I drive him home. Yeah. So anyway.
Sounds like a
Do you
good
guys
day.
have like a meeting now or? Oh, okay. I wasn't sure I was like part of your meeting and I just took up that.
No, you're our meeting.
Yeah.
Yes. Yay, thank you so much.